It may sound bad, but is it true? Or it may sound good, but is it false? That distinction is really what I think drives a lot of the dynamic in the culture war and everything else. It's really it's an argument between people who believe things that make them feel good but actually aren't true, and they really cling to those things, and other people who are kind of saying, look, I get that this sounds good to you, but it actually doesn't work in practice, and let's try and focus on what actually works.
We are in. Konstantin, how you doing, man?
Hello, mate. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. World's gone mad since I saw you last. Madder.
It's been mad this entire time, it feels like to me.
So I read your Substack a lot.
You do?
Yeah, no, I think it's brilliant.
Someone should.
No, come on, man. You got like 65,000 subscribers. But I remember seeing you'd written a while back, I'm neither left nor right. I was like, I kind of agree with that. And then recently you said, fine, call me right wing. What's happening?
It's the same article, really. What I'm saying is, if idiots want to call me right wing, they're welcome to, because I can't be bothered defending that argument anymore. But none of the things that used to make me left wing or in the center have changed.
Nope.
It's just the left has just totally abandoned these ideas, which were very commonplace. So I grew up watching comedians like George Carlin and Bill Hicks having a go at Christian conservatives for shutting down free speech, getting offended by humor. You can't say this, you can't say that. Well, that's no longer the Christian right mostly that's doing that. It's the religious left. They're just not Christian, you know. So that's one of the aspects of it. And then on all the other things, you know, I always think about it as you want to have the right policy for the right time. So, you know, I think the idea that you're going to be like in favor of low taxes and small government always, it's a bit naive, because there's times when you want to raise taxes a little bit and put more money into infrastructure, whatever. Same with immigration after World War II. Right, we needed loads of immigration to replace the people who'd been killed in the war. And so Australia, Canada, Britain, lots of other countries opened the doors to people and said, please come, help us rebuild our country. That was a time when having significant immigration was a good thing. But when you have a situation like the one we have now, where you've had very high levels of immigration without a really good reason or the infrastructure to deal with that influx, it doesn't seem to me to be right-wing to think we should slow down and integrate the people who've come and make sure we have a cohesive society. So on all of these things, I've not really changed my mind very much, but the world has gone mad, as you say. And so now, you know, I just can't be bothered. And, you know, you look on Wikipedia, which is fascinating, because we all know it's bullshit, right? We all know Wikipedia is bullshit.
Yeah.
We all know that a lot of the legacy media is bullshit, and you find this out if people write an article about you, as I'm sure it's happened to you, it's happened to me. You instantly find out it's all bullshit. Mm-hmm. Yet when you go to look up a guest on your show, what do? You put their name in Google, the first thing pops up is Wikipedia, you read it. When you read mine, it says, I'm a conservative commentator. Even though not only have I never said I'm a conservative, I've repeatedly said I'm not a conservative, right? So a lot of this is just like, I really can't be asked trying to prove to people who are operating in bad faith that I'm not an evil right-winger. If you want to call me an evil right-winger, I really don't give a shit anymore.
Yeah, but do you not think it's a case of, if you step outside the monoculture, you're considered right-wing?
You're called right-wing.
You're called right-wing.
A lot of these people know that you're not right-wing, and they will make that distinction privately, but for public purposes, that's what they'll do. And look, there is some truth to it, in the sense that, you know, we just had our Christmas party, right? Or the dinner parties that I get invited to. Most people at those places are going to be center right, but that's because the ideas that I believe in are now mostly protected and held as valuable in that sort of space. So if the fact that center right people agree with me makes me right wing, maybe it does. I don't know. But what I'm saying is, I would like the things that I believe to remain what they have been historically, which is actually shared throughout the political spectrum, which is when they would actually be implemented in law and practiced in reality, right? Like if we could get to a position where it's not a left or right wing thing that you think comedians should make jokes and not people, if people are offended, that's okay, that's fine, but that doesn't mean they get to cancel the comedian. If we had a situation where we could all agree that maybe the police intimidating journalists because they did a tweet that the police didn't like a year ago, like happened with Alison Pearson. If we could get to a point where we all thought, whoa, that's a bit much, right? If we could get to a point where we had a sensible conversation about immigration, where we thought some immigrants are good, but large-scale immigration has problems that come with that, and we have to either deal with those problems or not have large-scale if we could get, which by the way was the left-wing position for a very long time.
You're a Nazi now, though.
Exactly. So I would like us to get to a position where everything I'm doing and saying is totally unnecessary, and I could, just interview people about other things, which I'm very interested in, and write about other things, which I'm very interested in. I sort of think like we'll know we've got to the right place when we're arguing about fixing potholes and stuff like that. Like when all of this cultural warring ends and we can just get on with the normal business of like being a country or being a society.
I think we're a long way from there, though.
We are.
A long way. I mean, it's almost like you're saying is that your opinions come from you think about an issue. You try and think about it rationally. What is the right answer?
Yeah.
Not what is the ideologically centered right answer.
That seems to me like the right thing to do, controversially.
I know,
yeah.
But it's...
But the problem is that, this is why the crackdown on freedom of expression, particularly in Europe, is so pronounced compared to America. Obviously, they have, the First Amendment, and even more importantly than the First Amendment, they have what I call the First Amendment culture. Right, because the First Amendment is just words on a piece of paper, but they have a culture of like, this is America. Like, this is what they'll say to basically say, like, we don't do this. We don't visit, we don't send the police to people's houses for stuff that they said, even if it's stupid or outrageous, unless it's genuinely inciting harm of some kind. But in Europe, we don't have it. And the problem is that when you say, well, you just try to think about things from kind of first principles, the problem with that is that there's so many issues on which you're not supposed to do that nowadays, that you need restriction of speech, because otherwise people are going to start commenting on things. They're going to start saying, well, why is it that there are 40,000 jihadists on a watch list in the UK? Many of them foreigners who could be deported, but they're not, right? Well, if you need to suppress that, then you start intimidating people who say things like that, And I think because the emperor is so naked, the emperor has no clothes, you then have to really shut down the people who go, excuse me, what about his massive... So that's where I think it is. And, and you could go down the list. The trans issue, I think there's been some change on it, but that was the case on that issue for a long time as well. It's like the emperor has no clothes and he's got his massive dick out in a female changing room. Can we say something? No, that's bigotry. In the last day or two, the Congress in America has released a report which basically says that the most probable origin of COVID was that it leaked from a lab in Wuhan.
Can talk about that.
With the serious possibility that the reason it was created in that lab was gain-of-function research, which is when you mess around with the virus to make it more lethal or more potent or more, spread easier or whatever. Now, if you'd said that on YouTube during the pandemic, you literally would have been banned off YouTube. So that's why the restriction of speech is so prevalent now, because there are lots of things that you're not supposed to think, and the people, generally speaking, shut down speech because they want to prevent you from thinking, because it's actually very, very difficult to think without speaking out loud. Like my wife always makes fun of me for like talking to myself in the shower, but I do that a lot, and I'm rehearsing ideas, how I might frame something, and I'll often talk myself out of a position that I've assumed in the process of that, just saying things out loud. If you muzzle people, if you prevent them from speaking, you actually prevent them from thinking as well. And that's where a lot of this stuff is coming from. It's really an attempt to prevent certain things from being thought and then discussed in the public domain.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've had that with my brother. We're ideologically very different.
And he's wrong and you're right.
Sometimes. No, but no, you know what it is? It's the fact. No, but it does get like that sometimes. But no, what it is that when we sit down and discuss these ideas, he's very much from the left, and I'm certainly more conservative than him. We have some quite heated debates, but only by having those debates. Sometimes I've gone back and go, actually, I think you're right here. I haven't actually thought about that. But those kind of debates I want to have with my kids, or I want my kids to be having them in school. And if we can't have them, how do you figure out whether you're right or wrong? How do you sharpen your tools?
Yeah.
You just don't get to do it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I grew up, it's funny, I was asked by a friend of mine, Winston Marshall, to host a debate about Israel and Palestine at a festival that he created called Dissident Dialogues in New York earlier this year. And everyone was like, "Oh, mate, it's going to be really intense. Are you going to be all right?" And I was like, "My dad's Russian and my mum's Ukrainian. You think this is going to be worse than a dinner table conversation in my house?" So I grew up in a household where it was like people would say things, sometimes outrageous and controversial things. And then you'd be like, "Yeah, but what about this? And let's argue this and let's find." And it was all, I had this back and forth in front of me, and increasingly that I became part of. And so I learned from an early age that if you're going to say something, you best have a good reason for it. And if you say something and you don't, you're going to get found out pretty quickly. And likewise, I also learned to find gaps in other people's arguments. And it doesn't make me very popular at dinner parties. But what it has made me, I think, is someone who don't always succeed, but tries to get to the bottom of what an idea is and does it work logically. And that's been, I think, the truth is a useful thing in and of itself. You'd know this if you're running a business or a football club or a podcast or whatever, whether what you believe is true or not is really impactful on how successful that business is. Like if you have a business idea, but it doesn't map onto the reality of how other people have this experience, or to the consensual reality of the world that is intertwined with other people's opinions, then you're very quickly going to pay the penalty for that. But the reason I think we live in a world in which many, many people are able to sustain ideas that aren't verifiable in reality is that we've got social media and academia and all of these other places where you can sort of like conjure up any thought that you want, and you can say, well, you can change your sex by just saying, abracadabra Stacy, and now you're a different sex. And online, that's possible. Like you could change your name and everything on social media, and you can do it. Likewise in academia, the people who in the social sciences in particular, their ideas are never tested against reality. And it's one of the reasons I think there's always been a kind of snobbery in the academic world towards the business world, because the business people, they are these like rough and But the more I get to know business people, the more I realize like a lot of them, whatever their flaws may be, they've had to cut their teeth in a world where your idea is either true or not. And it doesn't matter how politically correct it is. It doesn't matter how pleasing it is for you to believe this. It doesn't matter how good it makes you feel. Ultimately, you're either right or you're wrong. And that seems to me to be a really important thing that increasingly people have started to forget about, which is it may sound bad, but is it true? Or it may sound good, but is it false? That distinction is really what I think drives a lot of the dynamic in the culture war and everything else. It's really it's an argument between people who believe things that make them feel good, but actually aren't true, and they really cling to those things. And other people who are kind of saying, look, I get that this sounds good to you, but it actually doesn't work in practice. And let's try and focus on what actually works.
I had it this week. I've been charged by the Football Association.
With what?
So our football program that goes out every home game, my photo in it is a picture of me on holiday in the US. I'm holding a gun.
Okay.
It's a provocative picture. There was one complaint.
Not in America, it's not.
Well, no, in America, and I'm on holiday,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But anyway, we beat a team, and their manager was upset, and he made a complaint about it. So the FA charged me. And so on Monday, I had my hearing, and they said, I've broken rule, whatever. I brought the game into disrepute, and I said, why? And they said, well, you've got a picture of you're holding a gun. Can't kids see this photo in your program? I was like, yeah, the same kids were playing Fortnite every day, shooting each other's heads off, wearing Man City Liverpool shirts. Anyway, it went on and on and on. And the guy, and I was being provocative, and the guy just said to me, he said, you're being provocative on purpose. And I said, I'm not responsible for your response, but provocation is defended free speech in the European Convention on Human Rights, because art is provocation, and we went round and round and round, and in the end they charged me.
No, of course they did.
And so I said I'm apparently not allowed to use this picture anymore, and it really kind of like hit me is that there is this distinct culture difference of freedom between here and the US, because you go to the US a lot. I go. There's certainly within the red states and even parts of blue states, there's this distinct culture of freedom and a distinct culture of the government is separate from us and we should never trust them. Whereas I come back here and I think there's this big shift where we don't have a culture of freedom and it's the government are responsible for looking after us. And I come back here sound like a nutter. But I think I'm not a nutter.
No, I am the same. I don't feel like I come back sounding like a nutter, but I do come back really hopeful in some ways that, you know, I think Britain is suffering from a kind of post-imperial identity where it's like we've had our empire, we've had our rah days, and now we're supposed to feel bad about the past and sort of play ourselves down and, you know, not aspire to greatness and not push for things and not to go for things. But I also think that these things, you know, move culturally, and you see what's happening in Argentina with Milei. You see what's happening or will be happening in America under Trump. And I don't know what's going to happen. It could be a disaster or it could be amazing. But if it is amazing, as it may well be, I think that can't not be inspirational to people in the UK, because we are part of the same civilization. And there was a moment, probably until about World War II, when the British Empire was the centerpiece of the West, of the Anglosphere, where we were the most powerful, the most dominant part of that, and everybody else kind of took their orders and their values from us. You know, in many ways, America is actually the place where British values really got constituted in a powerful way, and they created a country on that basis. What's happened since, you know, after World War II, Britain declined over time, and America is now the center of Western civilization. It's the cradle of it now. Maybe not the cradle, actually, but like the full-bodied adult now. And there is no reason why we in Britain can't accept our secondary role, but also start to buy into the culture that they have in the United States, which is one that is more individualistic from the perspective of, you know, it's your responsibility to go out and make of yourself what you will. And this is one of the fascinating things I find about Americans. Actually, you know, most Americans aren't super rich and haven't got loads of money in the bank, etc. The average American is very close to struggling financially. But the quality of life that people in America enjoy is far higher than it is here. And there are some, you know, economic and historical reasons for that. One of the things that I find, and I'm sure you do as well, is when you go over to America and you meet people, there isn't that guardedness and protectiveness that we have here. Like, other than Chris Williamson, for years when we were doing Triggernometry, there wasn't a single British podcaster who wanted to help us or wanted to network with us or wanted to connect. Everyone looked at us as competition. You go over to the United States, people who are bigger than you, people who are smaller than you, people who are on your level, they all want to find a way to collaborate. Their idea is like, let's do business together. And then everybody grows. Let's bake as much pie as possible. We've become far too focused in Britain and in Europe, I think, I'm like, how do we divide this pie evenly? And no one's bothered about baking and pie. And in fact, the people that are baking the pie, we say, oh, they're not paying their fair share. And when I look at the statistics of the amount of tax the top 1% or the top 10% of the country pay, I'm like, they're propping up the whole system.
The humble bee, a keystone species crucial to the survival of Earth's inhabitants. Here's how things would look if bees vanished. And here's how they'd look if humans vanished. But imagine if instead we became a keystone species by doing things the right way, by taking responsibility for our actions and becoming the solution. Iron mines the world's most responsible currency the right way. Because the future depends on it.
That fair share, pay your fair share is such a nebulous, pointless term. Because
I don't know what their fair share is, because at the moment, they're paying a lot of the tax that goes towards public services for everyone else.
It's an arbitrary statement.
And by the way, people are going to be like, oh, Konstantin's doing well now. Yeah. That's right. No, I mean, it's not just that. I've always believed this. And this is what I was going to say about Americans. Even Americans who are not successful, they don't look at successful people and resent them. They see them as inspiration. So when I was just doing the comedy circuit, being paid 20 quid to drive 4 hours up to Manchester and back to do a gig for 10 minutes to 30 people or whatever, I still wanted the opportunity to succeed on merit and to be rewarded for it. And when you create a society that really is centered around merit,
yep,
that is powerful, because then everybody ends up, this is of course idealistically speaking, but more so than a non-merit-based society, everyone ends up in the place that they're supposed to end up. That's why when you go to an American restaurant, you get the best service that you've ever had. Mm-hmm. Because the people there are there on merit, number one. Why? Because they can't succeed in that job. They can't live in that job unless they're really good, in which case they're going to get loads of tips. And then you get career servers and career waiters and career people working in that industry in a way that you don't in the UK. In the UK, it's basically foreign students, British students, whatever, doing those jobs for the most part. And it's the same with everything in America. The level of everything is higher because the level of competition is much higher, and competition is encouraged. And so you have to be really good to succeed.
Yeah, I mean, look, I experienced over there myself. I had 7 years. It's brilliant. Everyone's great.
Yeah.
Can you come on my podcast? Yeah. When? Tuesday. Can you fly to Texas? Yeah. Can you fly to New York? Not a problem. I'll be there. How do I help you be more successful? I've experienced that whole thing. And similar to what you say, I've come back here and started again. It's got a bit harder, It's a different kind of atmosphere. And I think what it is like, again, it comes back to culture, Konstantin. Out in America, it's like, this is America. I can be successful here. And where in the UK, it's like, oh, I've been successful, I should feel ashamed. There's like that culture.
Yeah, but there are I think, as I said, with the cultural dimension, I think there is, it doesn't take many people actually to shift the culture. No. And with all of us spending time in the US and coming back and trying to sort of share some of those values. I mean, like, I've got to know Jimmy Carr over the course of the last year really well. And he has probably always had that attitude, but he has that attitude in spades. He's always helping other people, from different political backgrounds and whatever. He's just a great guy. He really is like trying to encourage people. He doesn't have any of that loser mentality that a lot of people here have. And it doesn't take that many people, particularly people who've got big audiences and whatever, to spread that idea into the culture where people are listening to what you're saying and they're going, well, I'd like to be more like, I don't know, Stephen Bartlett or Jimmy Carr or whoever else. And I'm going to adopt more of that same mentality. So I genuinely think it's possible. And that could be one of the ways the culture changes over the next 4 or 5 years. Or it could be a complete fucking disaster. I mean, nobody knows.
Yeah, it's a weird one because I've felt this since Labour got into power, this kind of politics of envy coming back, and it's just like, it just makes me feel really sick. Like the debates that were regularly happening around the farmers' inheritance tax. So I spent a bit of time looking at that. I went to the protests and I spoke to some people, and the majority of the farmers just said to me, this was my grandfather's farm, went to my father, to me, and I spoke to Gareth when Josie said, my duty is to pass it on to the next person. And he said, look, if there are certain taxes that mean we have to sell part of it off, that's difficult for us. And I thought on that whole inheritance tax, the argument was wrong, where people were saying, well, why shouldn't they pay it when I have to pay it? And I was like, I actually think nobody should pay this inheritance tax. And it seems that under this Labour Party, we've got away from that idea where, like Thatcher said, the government doesn't have any money. It only has our money, right? It's not that anymore. It's like, how much of our money are the government going to leave us? And, we should be taking it from those greedy people, and billionaires should pay their fair share, and tax. It's like all this kind of culture of everything is, it's almost, I mean, you'll know about this. It's very, I know you don't like the loose use of the word communist, but it's very much like the government owns all of this, and we'll let you have what's left after we've spent our money.
Well,
I hate it.
That's kind of the extremes, the difference between communism and capitalism, right? Yeah. Capitalism is about, let's bake as much pie as possible, and then the people who did the most of the baking get the most of the pie. That's idealized, because you do get crony capitalism and whatever. On the other hand, you have communism, which is not about baking any pies at all. It's like, there is a pie, let's just divide it as
forever,
for as fairly as we possibly can. But actually, polling shows in this country, most people, if you say to people, do you want low tax, low volume of public services, or do you want high tax, high volume of public services, high quality public services, people will go for the latter. They want high tax, high quality public services. The problem is, we've got high tax, low quality public services.
I just don't think, I think it's hard to get both to work. I know some people say, well, parts of Scandinavia have achieved it, but I've been out there, and I don't think I particularly want to live there. I just don't see how you achieve both. But perhaps it's because we've got so much debt now. Unwinding our debt position can't get us there.
Yeah,
because it feels like, it's like sometimes when you criticize Labour, people are like, well, Conservatives did this. I agree. Conservatives were also terrible. But I don't think we can get out of this downward spiral of reducing public services, NHS waiting lists, by borrowing more and taxing more. I actually kind of think, I'm very much looking at what Malay's doing and thinking, actually, we need to strip everything back.
Well, I personally agree with you. It's not a particularly popular position in this country, I think partly for the reasons that we discussed. People see... this will be a very unpopular thing to say, but I remember during I think it was 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, and the household electricity and gas prices were going up, and it was like, what is the government going to do to protect people? And I was like, I don't know that it's the government's job to protect people against changes in prices. If there's hyperinflation going on, like, thousands of percent, maybe the government has a role. But generally speaking, it's part of life that things get more expensive, or they get cheaper, or whatever. Sometimes you can't afford some things that you want. Isn't
that's how I grew up?
Yeah, that's how I grew up. And I didn't grow, there was periods of my childhood when we were dirt poor. And it never would have occurred to us that it's the government's job to pay our gas bill. But even the Conservative Party, they led with this as if it's the job of government to deal with. So I agree with you. I don't see that taxing. And the problem is as well, it's like, who and what are you taxing? Because this is something that is like economics 101. You get taught it on day one at economics A level, and then everyone forgets it. Taxes, generally speaking, for most things, are a way to reduce the amount of that thing. So, for example, we put a tax on cigarettes to get people to smoke less. We put a tax on alcohol to get people to drink less. We put a tax on fuel because we want people to drive less and take the bus, or take the train, or take public services. We put taxes on things that we want to reduce the amount of. So what happens when you tax employing people? What happens when you tax small business? What happens when you tax the people who create the jobs? It's not rocket science.
Look, I own 4 businesses. I've talked about it relentlessly on here. It was getting harder under Conservatives. It's getting to the point under Labour. I'm just I've scrapped one project I was going to do because it's just not worth it.
Right.
We've got a little cafe. I've told this but 100 times. We've got a little cafe. We're opening in our town for our football club. So we have to pay 16,000 business rates to open it. So that's a tax before we've done anything. Obviously, then we have to decorate the place and kit it out. We have to get stock. We have to take on staff. We've got new employment laws where essentially from day one, everybody has full employment rights.
That was incredible, by the way.
Well, it's just stupid.
That's incredible. You're just going to bring someone in and you don't really know if they're going to work out. And from day one, they could turn up on day one and take sick leave.
Well, it's a protective layer for government.
Yeah.
It keeps people away from welfare because it's hard to get rid of people.
Yeah.
It's exactly what Argentina did.
But then what happens is people don't hire people or don't start businesses, as is the case with you.
Well, that's the big one. I mean, I think Argentina actually made it illegal at one point to get rid of people. I know, it's fucking insane. So you couldn't get rid of people.
That's funny.
So anyway, so you've got a higher minimum wage, which, by the way, I'm not opposed to a minimum wage, but I think there's certain people who would come and work in a cafe for £8 an hour and they're probably 16, 17, 18 years old or, whatever. But we also have to give them 12.0% holiday allowance on top of that, even though it might be a second job. And then, then we have to make a profit. And if we make a profit, we'll pay corporation tax and, we might pay a dividend. And, that's gone up to 24% cap gains on any dividend. So anyway, and then if the end of it, if we have any money left and I leave it to that boy, he's going to have to pay 40%. Honestly, you just look at it now, Konstantin, I go, I just can't be fucked.
But yeah, but why would you?
Cannot.
But this is exactly my point. When you tax something, you disincentivize that thing from being done. So when you tax business, you have less business. And then what you do, if you're a politician, you go, oh shit, our economy's not growing. Well, we have to pretend it's growing by boosting our GDP. Well, we can't boost GDP by actually doing things that actually create wealth. So we have to import people. That way we increase the number of people in the country. Then we can pretend we're growing. So the British economy hasn't actually grown on a per capita basis since 2007. It goes up and down. It hasn't recovered to the level that it was before the financial crisis. So on average, people are poorer now than they were nearly 20 years ago.
Well, it's even worse than that because when the government can't balance the budgets, they borrow more.
Yes.
And when they borrow more, it leads to inflation, so everything gets more expensive.
Yes.
So actually, every single direction we're being hit with, and I keep thinking, like, how do we... Actually, we don't just need a culture of freedom. We need a culture of understanding basic economics because we're voting for decline in a very painful way, which you can only have to look at other countries or history where you see exactly where this goes. You cannot borrow and tax your way to growth. You can only borrow and tax your way to poverty. But I don't think there's a widespread understanding of this.
Well, I don't know that that's quite true. I think you can borrow and invest your way into growth. For example, if the government was to borrow money to build housing, lots and lots of housing, that actually would be impactful because you're creating jobs and you're creating housing stock, which can then be sold. And you're facilitating people getting together, getting married, having kids. Like all of that has positive benefits. But when you just borrow to give people handouts during the pandemic because you've decided to shut everything down, when you just borrow money for other things that are not productive, that's when you've got the problem. Because I think, from what I understand, broadly speaking, is cutting taxes and cutting regulation and cutting expenditure works because people start businesses and whatever. But there's also room for public investment.
Of course.
So if you borrow for the right things and then actually invest the money, that works. But we don't do either.
We don't do either. We actually do the opposite.
Yeah.
I think this is why I don't even know if you've been down the Bitcoin rabbit hole since I spoke to you last, but this is why I've always been so focused on that historically. I didn't think I was going to bring it up today, but it's that idea that
I did.
Well, no, it hasn't really been coming up on the podcast.
Really?
No, not on this one, not that much. But I've spent a lot of time looking at that as just thinking about the basics of like economics. When you've got an inflating currency, you want to spend it as quickly as possible. When you've got a disinflationary currency, you have the opposite. You have to be very conservative about where you spend money. I'll give you one great example is that we buy merch for our football club. And at the moment, we've got a merch range we want to do, but we keep all our money in Bitcoin. And so at the moment, we're like, well, actually, we won't do that investment till next year because it won't have the economic return that we want. So just like these flipping of the incentives, but I'm guessing you haven't been down that rabbit hole yet.
Not too much, no.
We're going to get you down.
I'm buying gold.
Well, it's the same thing. But why are you buying gold?
Well, gold doesn't have the downs. It may not have the upside of Bitcoin. The speculative value of it is not going to shoot up in the way that Bitcoin has. It's also far less likely to go to zero than cryptocurrency.
That's not really what I meant. It's like the reason you're buying it, not buying it instead of Bitcoin, just itself. Because I think you're doing it for the same reasons as me.
Oh yeah, the reason I'm doing it is I think the value of our currencies is being inflated to hell. And frankly, there is a little voice at the back of my mind that says I want to have enough money in gold that I can like get a flight out of the UK if the shit hits the fan. Genuinely, it's like prepper mindset in some way.
So you are in that prepper mindset.
In the UK, I am. Yeah. Look, look. This summer we had massive riots around the country, and let's look at objectively what happened. I've got to be very careful to not be in contempt of court, but let's just say what may or may not turn out to be a terrorist incident. The guy in Southport has been charged with, he had an Al-Qaeda manual apparently, and ricin, and I have heard some other things pretty reliably that may or may not have been happening. That happened. As a result of that, we had large-scale riots. Not only that, we also had people who felt that their community was under threat from these riots, tooling up and going out in the street. And so what you've got is the makings of violent street confrontation, right? And I don't really see why that wouldn't keep happening over and over, because the underlying issues are not getting addressed, and in fact may well get worse over time. Even though our security services do an amazing job, from what I hear, in actually keeping down the number of terrorist attacks and terrorist incidents in this country, I think that's likely to carry on. And I think the reaction to that is likely to be more and more pronounced. And it should be. There's no reason why British people should tolerate dozens of terrorist attacks a year, or MPs being stabbed to death by Islamists, or any of that, right? So as that continues, and as the mainstream media, the formerly mainstream media, loses their ability to control the narrative on those issues, I think it's inevitable that things will get worse unless they really get addressed, and I don't see them getting addressed. So from that perspective, unless there's a dramatic shift in the cultural and political landscape of this country over the next 5-10 years, I really don't see why those people who are saying we're headed towards civil war of some kind, I would like to explain why they're wrong. I am a reasonably smart guy, I like to think. I can't think of a good explanation of why they're wrong. So when Elon says the UK is headed for civil war, I'd like to disprove that, because coming back to what I said right at the beginning of our conversation about sitting around at the family dinner table, someone says something, I try and find a way to disprove that. That's my first thought whenever anyone says anything. Are you sure about that? Have you? I don't see an explanation of why he's wrong about this. Why he's wrong to say that we're headed towards civil war. I haven't found a reason to disagree with that. The only reason I can think of is, well, maybe the British people will just accept their country becoming a different country.
Very important that you don't lose this, okay? This is your inheritance through Bitcoin.
Let Bitcoin rip. Don't rip up your Bitcoin. Set up inheritance with Casa.
Well, if we have a civil war, what are the two sides?
Well, civil war,
or is it more of a popular uprising?
Or just street violence, or whatever it is. You know, it doesn't really matter. I guess. Well, what we saw during the summer riots was, I don't know how to describe it, but people white British people who like a tear up, many of them, some of them, and some people who are rightfully angry about what happened in Southport, those two things coming together. And look, in any riot, the majority of it is not going to be people who've come there with like the intention to make a point. Most of them are going to be there to tear shit up because that's what they like to do. It was them. And then on the other hand, it was many people from the Muslim community who either felt threatened or felt that this was their opportunity to make some kind of statement or whatever, coming out on the streets to like defend themselves, so to speak, so you could get street clashes of that kind, and then you never know how that goes, because what people don't realize is once you're in that febrile atmosphere, all the rule book goes out of the window.
No, people do crazy shit.
Right? And then how is the government going to react? How is the police going to react? How's the army going to react if they get sent in to deal with that? Because I don't imagine there's many people in the military who are like, jihadism is great. We need to fight the people who are against jihad. Do you see what I'm saying? So this is all very dark, and I really hope none of this happens. And I'm doing my best to the tiny extent that I can to prevent it from happening by airing the issues that need to be aired right now to prevent that outcome. But I do see us heading down that path if we don't change course. And so for that reason, I would be irresponsible if I genuinely believed what I believe, which I do. I'd be irresponsible to not put things in place to protect my family against that.
So what does change course mean? What, fundamentally,
change course means a number of things. One of them means to immediately end illegal immigration. End. Right now, you do not get to come in if we haven't said you want to come in. And I say this, my mother, right? I'm a first-generation immigrant. My mother does not live in this country. When we had my son 2.5 years ago, she wanted to come and help out to look after him. She applied for a visa. I sent in a bunch of documents saying, here's my bank statement, here's my this, here's my that. I take full responsibility. I'll pay for everything. I'll buy her ticket. I'll look after her, all her expenses. If she needs healthcare, I'll take care. I've got the money to take care of it. Her visa got denied. At the same time, there's 70,000 people getting on the boat in France and coming over to this country illegally. We don't know who they are. We haven't checked their documents. They're coming from places that culturally are not very well aligned, let me put it diplomatically, with our values, right? And we're doing that every year. And we're building up the number of people in our country whose first act of coming here is to break the law. Now, people will throw statistics at you and go, well, actually, if you look at the statistics, illegal immigrants commit fewer crimes because they're worried about... How the fuck do you know how many crimes they commit? You don't even know how many of them there are. And most of the crime in this country goes unreported anyway. Because we all know if your house gets broken into or your car gets broken into or someone nicks your phone, what's the point of calling the police other than to get a crime reference number for your insurance? Because they're not going to do anything. Everybody knows this, right? Even police officers that I speak to knows that this is how it is. And it's not their fault. They're operating in an environment where that is the way that the system is, right? So you got to end illegal immigration. Then you got to lower legal immigration. You got to stop pretending that we're growing our economy. And you have to admit our economy is not growing, and importing more and more people isn't going to help. And then you have to make sure that the people who are here are encouraged by every means necessary to become British in every way, and to integrate into our society and to buy into the values of the UK, to buy into all the things that we believe about freedom of expression, about the treatment of women, about the treatment of sexual minorities, about all sorts of other things on which we agree. We agree that we should not have blasphemy laws in this country, as a Labour MP demanded in Parliament the other day. If that's what you want, you're not fucking British. You're not British if you want blasphemy laws. That's not what we do here in the modern world, right?
But it kind of has become what we do. It's not what you and I believe we should do.
Yeah.
I've had the debate very recently about hate speech laws. Trying to explain to somebody the downstream consequences of having hate speech laws, the fact that it stops us debating certain issues.
Yeah.
I'd love to see a poll if you just went out and asked people, do you think we should have laws against hate speech? think a very high percentage would say yes.
I don't think hate speech laws are un-British, although I don't want them. But what I'm saying is the idea that you can't insult a religion, which is what this guy was talking about. And by the way, so when I say you're not British, that would be true of someone who was born in this country to me too. I just think those values are incompatible with this society. If you want to criminalize homosexuality, as a lot of people do in some communities, that's not a British value, I don't think. And we could go down the full list. So we have to say to anyone who comes to this country, as I once did, you come here to become one of us. If you don't want to become one of us, we completely respect that. And you're welcome to choose another country that matches your values more. But if your values don't match ours, you're not welcome. If you refuse to learn the language, you're not welcome. If you want to impose your values on our society, like I'm from Russia. If a bunch of Russians came over and started demanding that this country become more like Russia, I'd be like, what are you doing? That's not why you didn't come here for that. You came to a country that has values. It has a worldview. It has a religious heritage that I personally don't buy into. I'm not an Anglican Christian, but I respect the fact that that's what the history of this country. And people say, well, it's not a Christian country. Look around. Walk around London. Tell me it's not a Christian country. That's this country's built on that, right? Even if I don't personally believe in that way, I have to recognize that that's what it is. And in all of these other ways, there is a way to be British. There are such things as British values, and you either buy into it or you're welcome to go to another country, as I did, which matches your values more. That's the choice. Yeah. And until we do those things, I don't think you're going to fix this issue.
It then comes down to how do you do these things? Because I still don't fully know what it means to be British. And I know that sounds weird. I know what it means to be from Bedford, where I'm from. And I know what it means to be from England and the things I care about personally. But I don't feel there's like a collective identity. I think there's a confused identity of the country right now. And I think because over a long period of time, a lot of the ideas about being British or being proud to be British kind of got suppressed because of hooligans of the 80s, and we didn't really want to wave our flags, and I don't know the answer, but I don't know how we get from this point to say, well, what is our shared identity?
Well, one of the shared things that we should all be able to buy into is that we love this country. And I when I used to do stand-up, I always had this joke. I'd say, I love this country, and I say so publicly, which is how you know I'm not really British. I haven't integrated. But the fact that we live in a country that we think is a good country is actually something that we should be able to unite around. And this is where a lot of the destruction of British history comes in, because that's how you teach people to hate their country. If you teach people the history of their society is all bad, then why would they like it? Why would they defend it? Why would they sign up for the army and go to the front line to fight for it? And I'm not saying people should be made to love Britain. That's actually an incredibly un-British thing to do. But the realization that actually we live in a pretty good place, our history is good. We should be teaching our children that our history is very good. The British Empire, for all its evils, was the most progressive empire in the history of humanity, and did a hell of a lot of good, including ending slavery, not only within its own borders, but in many, many other places at great cost. And I think it really starts from that. It starts from teaching children that they live in a great country which had a great history. Not perfect, of course, and there's certain periods where things were done that we would now not condone in any way, and we should talk about them. When my parents had a very brief period of their life when they had money, they sent me to a boarding school, and it was the same boarding school that Douglas Haig went to. Douglas Haig was the commander of British Armed Forces in World War I, and there's a statue of him outside of my boarding house. And when we went to our history classes around the corner, we were taught how useless he basically was, and how because of him, lots of people had died. But it didn't make us think that Britain was bad. It's like every country has certain things about it that were good and some things that were bad. But if you take it in the round, the history of this country is very good. And I think if you started there, you would get much further towards a more cohesive society.
Does it have to come from politics?
I actually think it can't come from politics.
Okay, does it come from the established culture of the people in the country are pissed off, which drives politicians to make change?
Well, I don't think anyone knows how exactly this battle gets won. It seems like in America, it is politics, because who gets to decide what's in the textbooks and the schools?
Yes.
Right? That seems to be determined at the political level. And so if you get parties that come in and say, enough of this woke history shit, we're actually going to teach children actual history, then maybe that is how it will get done. But that takes a big cultural shift as well, because it doesn't, the difference between the US and the UK is, if you look at the last election in America, who really changed the course of it? It was Elon, and it was people like Joe Rogan and Andrew Schultz and Theo Von and a bunch of others who had Trump on their podcasts. Yeah. So, but who are the biggest podcasts in the UK? It's not Triggernometry.
No,
it's not. If you look at the listens and
Stephen
videos,
Bartlett?
Stephen Bartlett, but he doesn't really talk about politics. If you look at the political,
well, the rest is politics, but that's establishment.
It's the rest is politics, and it's the news agents. Two groups of people who got everything wrong about the election. And I say this with all respect. Like, we've had Rory Stewart on our show, and he's a lovely guy, really great guy. He's wrong, but he's a nice guy. Alistair Campbell, I have less good things to say about. And, the news agents, it's where you go to find out how truly unbiased the BBC really was when they were all there, right? Because that's what it is, the news agents. It's a bunch of former BBC journalists revealing how incredibly woke and left-wing they are. But nonetheless, that seems to be what the country wants. And so it'll take a big cultural shift too before that happens. I think quite a lot of people have been cowed into submission. And also, there is this, Orwell wrote about this a long time ago. He said the British intelligentsia would rather be seen stealing from the poor box than standing to attention during the national anthem. There's this kind of like embarrassment about being British that I just think, actually, that's one area where we should be taking a lot more from America and saying, actually, I want the British flag on every fucking building in the country. I want us to be teaching children that, this is a good country, and to feel an affinity with it. Whatever their background, I want British Muslim children to be taught that they're British first and Muslim second, or that they're Jewish first and, Jewish second, and that they're British first. You know what I mean? And Christian and all of that, right? That they are British first. And I think that's where it comes from, having some kind of umbrella identity that British, Muslim, Christian, whatever your views are and beliefs are, you ultimately come back to the fact that we all live in this one piece of land, and we're united by the fact that we want it to prosper.
It feels like we're kind of an administration or a cycle behind the US, because I've been following like you. I knew nothing about JD Vance till I saw him, little about JD Vance until I saw him do a 3-hour interview, and I was like, okay, I kind of like this guy. And I've been a big fan of what the independent media is doing now. That I kind of want to do the same here. Very early days. I listen to your show. I sometimes listen to the rest of politics, but it grates on me because it's very establishment. And sometimes I hear their opinions. I'm like, oh, you don't really understand what real people are feeling. And I kind of hope for that kind of big growth in independent media, because the weird thing is, you've probably noticed this, over half the population voted for Donald Trump and they wanted drastic change. But it felt like here, about 90% of the people thought Trump was the second coming of Hitler, and they could not understand what was happening there. I understood, because I've been out there, spent time with people. But you come back here, we've got this, I think it comes mainly from media.
That's exactly where it comes from.
Yeah.
That one is a really interesting thing to talk about, because we went to the Trump rally in Madison Square. The Nazi rally, exactly.
Was it good?
It was a really interesting experience. Yeah. Really interesting experience. I did you would have seen on my Substack, the satirical piece I wrote about it, and then the video I did about it. But when I was there, I realized why we think what we think about America in the UK. So our journalists, the Emily Maitlisses and the Alistair Campbells and the Rory Stewarts of the world, they don't actually travel to America. They travel to DC, which is like 92% Democrat voting. They travel to New York. Some of them might go to LA, right? They go to all the big cities, which are incredibly left-wing. And who do they hang out with in America? They see other people of their class, other journalists who live in those cities who are all incredibly left-wing. I was very lucky over the last couple of years. I was on tour with Jordan Peterson, and I wasn't mostly doing the big cities. We were doing kind of medium-sized cities. So we did New York and a couple of other big venues, but mostly it was like New Orleans, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Oklahoma, El Paso, Fort Worth, Sugar Land, like all these places that British people mostly haven't even heard of, let alone been to. And every night after a show, I'd go out to a cigar bar or just hang around, just go for dinner or something. And you talk to people and you really get a real experience of what Americans are really like. But I've been to Utah, I've been to Colorado this year. I've traveled really all over the flyover states as well as the coasts. But that most British journalists have never done that. So they're getting their opinions from other woke journalists in big cities in America, and that's what we are told is America. And so we go, I can't believe they vote for Trump. Yeah, it's because you've never seen a real American, and so I think it really is just the ignorance of the sort of so-called elite class, and it's a willful ignorance. They don't. And part of it is actually, maybe they don't have as much money as they used to and they can't do proper journalism. Because really, if you wanted to do real journalism about the American election, what you do is you spend a few weeks going to all sorts of different places in the battleground states. You'd go to Pennsylvania, you'd go to Michigan, you'd go to, Georgia, you'd go to lots and lots of other places and talk to people from both sides. And you go, why are you voting this way? You're voting that way. And really show the real discussion and the real conversation in the United States. And one of the things that really needs to be explained to British people that we don't understand at all is just because we speak the same language and just because we watch Hollywood and just because our journalists parrot CNN talking points doesn't mean we understand American culture. And they're not the same as us. In many ways, I would say there's more similarity between Europeans who speak different languages than there is between the British and the Americans who speak the same language.
And there's two very distinct US cultures.
Yeah, several. But
there's a very distinct... there's a Republican... I think there's quite a strong Republican culture. And then there's all the flavors of liberal.
Well, I'd go further than that. I mean, California is a world of its own, right?
Yeah.
San Francisco and Los Angeles are not like Austin in Texas, which is a blue city as well.
Sure, but I've spent a lot of time there. It feels like there's a large number. I tell you what it is. I was talking to my son on the way in, and I said the interesting signal of this election was the leaders in business or the cultural commentators, and even some of the politicians who started to shift from Democrat to Republican, because they're the ones, they're not voting ideologically, they're voting with their business, or they're voting with the decisions they have to make. The Mark Andreessen show with Rogue was fucking brilliant. We had to listen to that. But I also just saw this thing where Eric Adams has been getting criticised because he's going to work with the Trump border czar. It's like, no, I need to protect my city. Yeah. I said the people where these decisions actually really affect them, they've started to shift Republican. And so there's a lot of Democrat business people I know who shifted Republican.
That was one of the big shifts of the election.
It was wild, but it's because they've had their businesses affected. They've been silenced or they've been debanked. I don't know. I've been debanked here myself, but there's a lot of things that are happening, and I think that was the big shift. Whereas I think most voters are still voting culturally. The common person.
I think you're voting on economics, actually.
Well, certainly on economics, and I think that's what's going to happen here in the next election. But that big shift, I've been out to LA. There's a lot of people I know are Democrat voters and now Republican voters.
I know, I totally get it. The point I'm making to you is, if you live in LA and go to Erewhon and buy a Reiki infused water for $15 a bottle, that's a whole different culture to New Yorkers, who are also, statistically speaking, very left-wing, or to DC, which is left-wing. So there's subcultures that exist in all of these big places. California, I would argue, is a world of its own. The South is a world of its own. The Northeast is a world of, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of variation across America in that way that we generally have no conception of at all in this country. We just, because we watch Hollywood and we're like, oh, this is what Texas is like because we saw one movie.
Do you think those same media commentators and journalists may also not recognize a change that will come here ahead of it coming?
At Ledden, we've built the best Bitcoin-backed loan platform in the world. Proven, trusted, growing. Ledden's proven track record speaks for itself. Visit ledden.io/Mr. Obnoxious to get started. Ledden, there is no second best. Ledden is not regulated in the United Kingdom. Any credit products or virtual asset services provided by Ledden are not subject to UK regulatory protections. Please consider the risks associated with virtual assets and consult a financial advisor before making any decisions.
Well, of course not. But imagine you are, to pick a name out of random, Emily Maitlis.
Yes.
You've been at the BBC for 20 years. You live in I don't know where she lives, but I imagine she doesn't live in a hovel. Right? So you live in a very comfortable house somewhere in a nice part of London. You get chauffeured into your studio because you're too famous to go on the tube, etc. Where are you going to get the real world information from? You're surrounded by people who not only share your opinions, but actually you are in a position of authority towards them. So none of them are really going to challenge you because you're rich and famous and whatever. Where are you going to get the information from? Taxi drivers? Well, you have to be willing to actually ask their opinion, and why would you ask a taxi driver his opinion? Because he's probably racist and whatever, right? I think this phrase out of touch, it gets overused, but I really genuinely know that it's quite hard for those people unless they're genuinely really in touch with, we just had Alison Pearson on our show, for example, right? And she talks about how she lives outside of London. She talks to her neighbors, blah, 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 blah. It's very difficult if you're not purposefully kind of doing that to actually be in touch with the ordinary person. And we've seen that over and over and over, from Gordon Brown, and, there's some woman says something about, I don't know if you remember this incident way back when, Gillian Duffy or whatever. And it's very hard for these people to be in touch with ordinary people in their own country as well, because it might as well be a foreign country, because they don't go to Bedford. Yep. With all respect to Bedford.
No, they don't.
And why would they? But you know what I mean, right? It's like, it's just what it is. And unless they really get the need to connect with ordinary people in some way, or to at least to try and listen to their opinions, they are going to be incredibly disconnected.
I actually think it's worse than that sometimes. I think they hold a contempt for some of the normal working people of this country.
Yeah.
I think someone like James O'Brien, I'm not a fan, I'm afraid. I think he has contempt for normal working people. And
why do you think that is?
I think, why is James O'Brien or the political elite?
Just whatever.
Because maybe it's just the job he's had to do. He's had to constantly defend a position that becomes even harder to defend. So he's become better at defending it. I see the guy criticizing people on his show while sitting down with Tony Blair, who I consider a war criminal, without giving him the hard questions. And so I just think you get sucked into that kind of worldview that, you're not intelligent enough, you're not smart enough. The best one for me is when populism is used as a pejorative. And to me, populism is a response to the popular people. The popular number of people who are pissed off. That's what populism is to me. It's a reaction to being treated like shit or ignored. You've got your costs going up, you've got housing going up, you've got bills going up, the government's spending more money, you've got higher taxation, you can't feed your kids, school education's going to shit. I think people are going to fucking had enough of this shit. And so I think they hold a contempt, and they hold the same contempt for reform. And I'm not calling myself a reform voter yet. I'm intrigued by what they say they will do and whether they can do it. But there's a contempt for reform voters, like you're some kind of idiot or racist. How could they ever run the country? And I just find this contempt frustrating because it does start to feel like the peasants and the elites. It does start to feel like, hold on, you're a politician. You should be listening to these people. Come to Bedford. Yeah, come down Bedford High Street. I'll show you where the people are doing crack next to the Bedford Corn Exchange. There's an open drug exchange. I'll show you all the people who've got businesses down there. Who've now got a radio system because there's crackheads breaking into shops.
Yeah, but if I'm that's the point is, if I'm James O'Brien and Emily Maitlis, why do I want to go down to Bedford and see crackheads? I want to live in my plushy suburban house and enjoy my life, you know. And when you're telling me about crackheads, I just think you lack compassion for poor people who are struggling with drug abuse issues or whatever it is. That's the way they see the world. And you're right. And by the way, you reminded me of a story I've never actually told publicly, I don't think. There was a point when I was doing stand-up a long time ago when I won a competition for comedians, and the prize was for new comedians, and the prize was a 4-hour or a full day, I can't remember, coaching session with like a comedy coach. And this was around the time when I was offered this contract to perform at university. I think we may have talked about this last time, I don't remember. And I turned it down. It became a big news story. So my point is, at this time, I was really focused on that story and free speech. And I said to her, you know, I want to make an hour show about this issue, about what happened with me, and blah, 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 blah. And she was like, well, you know, Konstantin, the first thing you need to think about is who is going to be your audience. And, you know, if you talk about free speech, then the Brexit people will come. And I was like, okay. And she was like, but no, that's terrible. You don't want them to come. And the face she pulled when she said it was one of disgust and contempt. So the one thing I've never really understood is, you know, I've traveled around the country and I did probably thousands of comedy shows to all sorts of people, not my own shows, but just like going to gigs in a comedy club or in a pub or whatever. And you meet all sorts of people. And there are some people who are like the stereotypical Brexit voter with a Millwall tattoo on his face or whatever, who may not be the most tolerant, welcoming, pleasant person. In fact, some of them, not picking on Millwall fans specifically, but there are some people who are really nasty and unpleasant and whatever. But I also found that actually the vast majority of people, whatever their political views, were really incredibly decent. And so I just never had this attitude of like, if you have a political opinion that's different to mine, automatically I'm going to assume you're a bad person. And that was the default setting in the comedy world when I was in it. I don't know if that's changed. I don't imagine it has in this country. So I saw that very early on, that a lot of people have this. And what was interesting to me is actually the person in question was not some posho middle class person, a pretty working class person who'd done well for themselves and come up perhaps, but they just, the people in the arts and the media, and they just have this like, oh, these are dirty, disgusting, you know, to get them back down the pit type of thing. And I don't know if that's the most healthy attitude to have to your fellow citizens. And one of the most difficult things about that is it really prevents, if you feel contempt and disgust for people, it's very difficult to understand where they're coming from, because it's ironic that the people who claim to be compassionate and empathetic and loving and caring, they're the ones who are most blinded to the suffering of their fellow man by their own class prejudice or political prejudice or some form of snobbery. And it is a big problem in this country for sure.
Well, that happened on Brexit, so I really struggled, Konstantin, with the, you know, should I vote Remain? Should I stay? You know, I voted to Remain in the end.
Me too.
But the strange thing was, the way I saw the Remainers speak to those who voted or categorize those who voted to leave made me think, hold on, I don't want to be on your side.
Totally.
I want to be as far away from you as possible. This is disgusting. This is a class war. You're saying these people are stupid. How do you know what, even if it is a Millwall fan, or you're just like, how do you know where he's living or what the impact in his community is?
Oh, by the way,
I know you're not saying that,
but look, statistically speaking, a lot of people are stupid.
Yeah.
Right? It's like George Carlin, who I mentioned earlier. He had a joke about this. He said, think how stupid the average person is. Now imagine half of them are even more stupid than that. Right. But nonetheless, you have to also recognize that just because someone doesn't have an IQ of 150 and a PhD does not mean that they're incapable of knowing the circumstances of their own life better than you. You don't need to have a high IQ or university education to know that your wages are being driven down because lots of low-skilled people have come from another country who are now doing the same job as you. You don't have to be super clever to do that. So just because people don't talk well, or even if they're not actually that clever, does not mean that their opinion is invalid. Their opinion may well be more valid than yours if they're talking about something in which they have actually a direct stake. They have skin in the game. So, not everyone is going to be super smart or sound super smart when talking to James O'Brien. That doesn't mean that they're factually wrong about the things that they're saying, about the impact of mass immigration, for example. I bet you someone who works as a plumber making 30 grand a year knows a lot more about the impact of low-skill mass immigration on this country than James O'Brien, who doesn't have to compete with someone from Romania or from India or from wherever to actually put food on the table for their family. So I've never been one to there's this very fashionable on the populist right to be like, well, everyone's really clever and you can't call people. Some people really are stupid. But even if they are, it doesn't mean that you get to overrule their opinion, particularly when it comes to things that affect them.
Well, and if you do overrule their opinion, you're essentially living in a bubble.
Yeah.
And a bubble of opinions maybe of your cohort of friends. And in some ways, it's kind of counterproductive yourself, because if you're not talking to people, you're not really understanding. Like I say, I don't really think a lot of these people understand the feeling of the nation. I mean, I've had it locally where I am. I do think there's a contempt for reform voters. I would say the majority of people I'm speaking to these days are saying, I'm going to vote for reform. I don't want Labour. I don't want Conservatives. I think that's a reflection on the low voter count. They want to vote for reform. And I don't know if reform can do it. I'm certainly looking like you across the US of what's happened with Elon and Trump and Vivek, and it sounds exciting. And God, I hope they do something amazing, because if not, I don't know what we do. But I think there's going to be a growing jealousy from here. People going, I want that.
Well, jealousy is not a very useful emotion, one that I've found to be much more
inspirational then.
Yeah. And actually, that's another thing that we could do better on in this country versus America is, people over there, in my experience, are much more inspired by the success of others. Here, there's
tall poppies.
Yeah, there's tall poppy syndrome. So, but even if it is jealousy, maybe that will be enough. If the economy in America grows because they actually make energy cheap and therefore have an economy, then a lot of people in this country are going to look at that and go, well, the US is growing 5 times as fast as we are, and people there are feeling wealthy and starting businesses, and we're struggling. Why can't we have that? There are a couple of reasons why I think it's going to be much more difficult in this country than and it was very hard for Trump to get elected a second time. One of them is the parliamentary system. So if you're talking about reform, but it doesn't really matter, it's reform or the Greens or whoever, if you're going to make an impact, you can't just have one charismatic leader and a couple of people under them who are good, which is what reform have. They have Farage, who's the front man, and they have Rupert Lowe, Richard Tice, a couple of others who are really pretty good in terms of delivering the reform position, communicating, etc. But they need, in order to actually win the election, they need 300 people like that. Right. Whereas Donald Trump really didn't need to have a team of 300 MPs, potential MPs. He needed a team of 5 or 6 people to be like the front of the team. And then, of course, he's got to have thousands of people who are going to staff their positions, but they don't have to get elected. So that's the difference. Another thing, as we've already talked about, in a country in which more people get their opinion from the rest as politics. And again, I don't even mean to be slagging them off personally. I'm just saying their opinions have been proven wrong.
Yes.
But
over and
but
over
people
again.
Still listen to them. So what does that tell you about whether the demand of the nation's at? If you see what I'm saying.
I think the demand of the nation is there because Tommy Robinson's done very well. And I've never been really a huge fan of Tommy Robinson. I just not my kind of person. But he has an audience. I think there is a demand out there for somebody who isn't establishment. You've done very well. Come on, man.
But this is the point I'm making to you is the establishment-based new media is more impactful than what we've done at Triggernometry.
But who's growing quicker?
I don't know. If you look at the audio numbers, I'm pretty... Well, look, the rest is politics sold out the O2.
So I would say compared to... You're doing better compared to the mainstream media.
Mm-hmm.
If you talk about the mainstream independent media, the establishment, sure, fine. But I think soon people will realise, hold on, they're saying the exact same things as the BBC and the Sky News. And I think there's just this growing kind of like, I don't want to say populist revolt, but I think there is a demand for something else.
I think there is a demand for something else among a large group of people. I also think there's a very large group of people who want their preconceived notions to be pandered to by people like Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart. And I see that as a very powerful group of people in this country. They tend to have more of the money. They tend to have more of the influence. They tend to have more of a presence in the legacy media to the extent that it still matters. And this is the other thing about the UK. In America, everyone is very simple. It's just like, where are the numbers at? But here, and there's good aspects to this as well, but we have this kind of like, it's really... Like, you go on the BBC and you get paid 25 quid and no one watches... But you're like, I was on the BBC. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and there are not many mainstream programs that are really still have a big audience. Like Question Time is still one of them that people will watch. Yeah. I've been on that a few times. But I'd struggle, Good Morning Britain, do people still watch that? I don't know.
I don't.
So, but some people do, I guess. I think, that prestige dimension is still an issue, but we do have a chance to turn that around because, as you say, we do pick things up from America. So American politicians, both left and right, have realized, new media is where it's at. If people in this country wake up, and, Nigel Farage has been ahead of the curve on this so much. Yep. He actually, one time we had him on, I think after the show, he told me that kids call him TikTok man. Because he's on TikTok crushing on there. And he told me that Brexit never would have happened without YouTube.
Interesting.
And so he was very early to it. But when you look at the leaders of the mainstream parties, they're not putting themselves up for scrutiny on a 2-hour podcast.
Of course they aren't. I mean, but that's what you want to hear, right?
Yeah.
I want to hear you interview Angela Rayner. I want to hear... I want to interview Kemi. I want to ask them the questions. Yeah. But I think that might come through, Konstantin. I think what may happen is... we've spoken to some people on the fringe. I've spoken to some people. I spoke to Ben Habib and I've spoke to Steve Baker. They're kind of on the fringes on the exit. I'm trying to get into a couple of people who are actually, have got seats in Parliament. And I think what will happen is people will start to demand this, and it might become a bit like, well, hold on, JD and Trump are willing to talk to Rogan for 3 hours. Kamala said she would offer an hour and wouldn't come to the studio. I think you start to judge a lot from that. I'll try and force it through.
Yeah, well, look, I think we're probably going to have Kemi on at some point. And I'd love to have Starmer on. And by the time of the next election, I'd like to think we should be in a position to have all the leaders of the major parties on and talk about stuff. Whether they are up for that is a whole different question. So we'll find out.
And the questions I think you would ask would be very different from an Alistair Campbell or a Stewart.
And by the way, on all of them, people, we started this conversation about talking about me being called right wing. I would give Tory candidate, whoever that is, as hard a grilling as I would give a Labour candidate, because I care about the issues, and neither of them is doing a good job.
Well, I was saying to somebody in here the other day, I was like, I think my favourite politician is Angela Rayner, and I disagree with her on everything because I think she's real. And so I think if you can separate yourself from that and do a good... Look, I want to hear you interview Kemi.
Me too.
What gives you optimism, Konstantin?
What gives me optimism?
Give me some hope.
Well, look, personally, I've always been optimistic. And it's not hard. Francis and I are two idiot comedians who started a podcast in a room above a comedy club, and now we have... over 1 million YouTube subscribers. We're spending loads of time in America. We've done amazing things that very few people would have imagined that we'd do. So it's very easy for me to be optimistic and grateful on a personal level. But at a level of society, I think that what's happened in the US, to me, was a big shift, because at least there's the chance of things being different. Americans had a choice and they made it. And I'm hopeful that can be an inspiration to the rest of the world. And the important thing for British people who don't like Trump, which is the majority of them, to say is the British version of Donald Trump does not have to be Donald Trump. Does not have to be crass and obnoxious and you know, the way that Trump is, because as I said before, Trump is a reflection of American culture, which is a bit more simple, a bit less sophisticated, much more pragmatic and business and all of this stuff. A British Trump or Trump-like movement, which fundamentally is an anti-decline, pro-growth movement, does not have to be spearheaded by someone who offends our poor little British sensibilities. That person can be much more British in the way that they conduct themselves, while still having the message of making Britain great. I don't want to say make Britain great again. I don't want to, conquer the African continent for the British Empire once more. But Britain, there's no reason why Britain, one of the largest economies in the world, home to only about 70 million people, yet so dominant around the world. There's no reason why this country can't provide a great quality of life for its citizens. There's no reason for that if we get our shit together. And so, given that we've seen from America that it's sometimes possible to actually elect people who at least promise to do that, maybe that's reason for optimism.
I hope you're right. Listen, congratulations on everything. I do love your Substack, and I think you and Francis have done an amazing job. It's really cool to watch, and I love the pod. Keep doing your thing. Appreciate you coming in, man.
Thanks for having me, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Great.
See you later.